Hello and welcome to this first chapter of our Dialogues on Applied Linguistics. Today our topic is Bilingualism Matters, the importance of being bilingual. Let's begin by talking about bilingualism in the world. We all know that globalization has made it obvious that everybody needs to learn all the languages, and this is obviously something that we can see because bilingualism is seen as a great advantage both at the personal and professional level. This according to a study of the European Commission. Now, obviously something that probably a lot of people do not know is that over 50% of the world population is actually bilingual. So this means that bilingualism is not a recent phenomenon, and it is something that has actually been common in the world population. To illustrate this point, let's look at this map developed by the Endangered Languages Project. We can see that all of these points on the map represent zones of linguistic diversity. These are places where there is an interaction of different languages. So according to the 2019 edition of Ethnologue, there are about 7,111 living languages in the world. So bilingualism is part of this linguistic and cultural diversity in the world. Now, if we zoom in, we can see that, for example, in Europe, there is a great number of the population who are bilingual. The total in the European Union is 24% of people who speak at least one additional language. And we can see that most countries have a high percentage of bilingual population. And not only that, there are also some people who speak at least two additional languages or three. So this is something that shows us that bilingualism is more common than we usually believe. Another example that we can provide to illustrate the pervasiveness of bilingualism is the case of the United States. Most people think that Americans are mainly monolingual. However, according to these numbers provided by the 2017 US Census Bureau, about 48.30% of the United States population uses a non-English language at home. In other words, over 160 million people in the United States are bilingual because they use more than one language in their everyday lives. And obviously, when it comes to English, we can realize that this language illustrates how bilingualism is important. If we look at the numbers of English-speaking people in the world, we can see that surprisingly, only 33% speak it as a first or native language. That is 500 million people. But on the other hand, there are 1 billion people, that is 60% of the English-speaking population, that speak English as a second or a foreign language, which is impressive and which also shows us that English is a global language that fosters bilingualism. Now let's look at the situation in our country, especially when it comes to bilingualism with Spanish and national languages. We can see, according to this graph developed in 2000, this is not very recent, but it illustrates the phenomenon that I want to point out, that a great number of the speakers of a national language are also bilingual. That means that they speak Spanish. So according to these numbers provided by the Bank of Educational Indicators, we can see that about 10 million people were bilingual in Spanish and a national language. This unfortunately has decreased in 2020 by only 7 million people. However, this illustrates that in our country there is an important number of the population who speak a national language and Spanish. And here, obviously, we're not counting a great number of people who are bilingual in Spanish and a foreign language. Now that we have pointed out that bilingualism is a multifarious and pervasive phenomenon, let's look at the definition and classification of bilingualism. First of all, we can say that bilingualism can be simply defined as the ability that some people have to speak to a different extent 2 or more languages. Now, we can simply say that those people who use more than one language in their everyday life can be called bilingual. There are obviously different kinds of bilingualism, and before we present them, we're going to see the different dimensions of bilingualism. We can see, first of all, that bilingualism can be an individual or social phenomenon, that obviously there can be a different kind of relationship between the languages spoken by people, and obviously that each language is going to have probably a different function, sometimes the same one, and that your kind of bilingualism will depend on your age and the kind of acquisition of the additional language or languages. That obviously, depending on your level of comprehension and production of the 2 languages, that means the different skills that you can manage, you will be a different kind of bilingual. And finally, we can also say that depending on your level of proficiency, you can be classified into a different kind of bilingualism. When we look at the first dimension of bilingualism, we can obviously see that bilingualism can be individual or social. This means that a person can be bilingual in a monolingual community, but also the whole community may make use of 2 different languages for different purposes, or may use different versions or varieties of the same language for different social purposes. This is what is called diglossia. Now, in situations of social bilingualism, we can have 2 different kinds of bilingualism: additive bilingualism or subtractive bilingualism. First of all, we can see that there could be 2 different languages in the same community, but one of them is probably going to be more powerful or more prestigious than the other. So they are going to be in a different kind of relationship in which a language has some functions and another one has another functions. And we can see the example of the national languages here in Mexico that are used mainly at home or within the family, but then Spanish is going to be used for all of the other purposes like education, science, etc. So we can say in these cases that there could be additive bilingualism or subtractive bilingualism, and we're going to illustrate this with an example. Let's see what we mean by additive and subtractive bilingualism. First of all, in additive bilingualism, a person is going to learn one language and then is going to start learning another language, and the person is going to become more and more proficient, and then in the end the person will manage 2 different languages, and he or she will use these languages for different kinds of purposes. In a situation of subtractive bilingualism, this is different. So the person has one language first and is going to start learning another language, is going to become more proficient in the second language, and eventually the person is going to lose proficiency or stop using their first language, and eventually will lose it or become passive bilinguals. So this means because it is important to learn the new language, the first language is forgotten. This is what happens to children of immigrants in different parts of the world, and this is what happens to children born in families where they speak a national language here in Mexico, such as Nahuatl, because the children are eventually going to learn Spanish and forget Nahuatl or Otomi or Tarahumara. Now, this subtractive bilingualism can span over generations. For example, in the first generation, the person is going to speak just the original language, the first language, and then their children will probably speak that language plus an additional more prestigious language. And finally, in the third generation with the grandchildren, probably they're going to be more proficient in the second language or the new language, the prestigious language, Spanish in this case, and then Nahuatl or the original first language is going to get lost until eventually the coming generations will be mainly monolingual, and that's what we call this subtractive bilingualism. Now, the second dimension of bilingualism concerns the level of bilingualism and the context of use. So we can have different kinds of bilingualism, such as passive bilingualism, incipient bilingualism, subordinate bilingualism, coordinate bilingualism, and finally compound bilingualism. So, as the name suggests, a passive bilingual is a person who has passive skills in both languages, but only productive skills in one. That means that person can understand two languages, but speaks only one. The incipient bilingualism is a situation in which we have a very limited competence in a language, as when we're learning a language and we are in an A1 or even A2 level. Now, the subordinate bilingualism is when you have developed an additional language, but there is one dominant language. So this means that there are many things for which you cannot use the second language. So this will correspond probably to the level B1, in which you are an independent user, but you're still very limited concerning the kinds of situations in which you use the second language. The coordinate bilingualism is a situation in which you have achieved a good mastery of the additional language. This means that you can pretty much communicate in different kinds of situations, but you use these two languages for different purposes. For example, in our situation, we learn English, but we use English mainly for academic school purposes, but we don't use it in our everyday life. So we're limited in the sense that we cannot use the language for more familiar uses, and therefore it is as if each language has its own domain of use. We are bilingual, but we don't use the languages in the same context for the same purposes. Now, compound bilingualism is the kind of bilingualism in which you can use both languages in all kinds of contexts for all kinds of situations. So this is what will correspond, according to the Common European Framework of Reference, to the level C2 and C1. So this means that you can use the language for a wide range of uses in different contexts, and you can manage a very, very informal register of the language and an extremely formal register of the language. Now, according to the age and the way in which you acquire your languages, you could be a native bilingual, or we can say that you had a bilingual acquisition when you learn both languages from birth in the same way. So these are children who from the start are exposed to two languages, so they're going to acquire them at about the same time. So this can also be called simultaneous bilingualism, but we can call it only when the languages are learned at the same time, but not necessarily from birth. And another kind of bilingualism is consecutive bilingualism, which is more common with foreign languages because you learn one language and then you study and then learn an additional language. And there is also the distinction between second language acquisition, in which the learning is naturalistic. This means that you pick up the language by being exposed to it in different kinds of communicative situations. So it's not learning, it's acquisition. And obviously, we can have the same process that is replicated in the case of a foreign language. This is called instructed second language acquisition, right? And finally, we can have a situation in which you are not in the country where the language is spoken, you are already an adult, and then you study a foreign language. So we call this foreign language learning. It goes without saying that the most effective kind of bilingualism that can lead to compound bilingualism is bilingual acquisition or native bilingualism. Now, let's talk about the benefits of bilingualism. There are many, and they are very important. The most obvious advantage of being a bilingual is that you're going to have better job opportunities with higher salaries, that this in turn will give you greater opportunities for personal and professional development, and that finally you will find different ways in which to perform academic international mobility, that you're going to have the opportunity to get scholarships and study masters, doctorates, or have the opportunity to work in multicultural settings. So you can see the sources here: United States, Canada, Spain, European Union, and obviously here the scholarship opportunities that we have in Mexico. Why do bilinguals have more opportunities? Basically, because they have a higher communication potential in different countries. So this means that if you're a Mexican and if you speak only Spanish, you can communicate in 31 countries in the world. But if you learn French, you will add 54 other countries. And if you learn English, you will be able to communicate in 137 more countries, which will increase your communicative potential to 222 countries in the world. So you can communicate with a lot of people for business, study, and research purposes. In a similar way, if we look at the number of speakers, in the same situation, if you speak only Spanish, you can communicate with over 527 million people in the world. But if you speak French, you can add almost 300 million more. And obviously, with English, you add 1.5 billion other people, which makes you able to communicate with a great number of the world population, which will be over 2 billion people. So this shows you that being a bilingual opens up a window, an enormous window of opportunity for personal and professional development. Now, besides the job opportunities and the communication potential, the bilingual person has very important cognitive benefits. So, it has been found in different studies that learning and using two languages can have a very deep impact on the brain structures and in your cognitive functions in general. Now, particularly, we can see that bilingualism has a positive effect in the Corpus Callosum and the Frontal Lobe. So this means that part of the Corpus Callosum of the bilingual brain is larger in area than the one of monolinguals. Let's see what the Corpus Callosum is. When we look at this diagram, we can see the red part that is the Corpus Callosum. This is a part of the brain that joins the two hemispheres. In this zone, we can find approximately 200 million axons. Now, what are the axons? The axons are the connections between neural cells or neurons, right? So we can see here one brain cell on the left and another brain cell on the right, and the bridge between them is the axon, this part of white matter that makes it possible for the neurons to communicate with one another. The second part of the brain that is most stimulated by bilingualism, by the use of two languages, is the frontal lobe that we can see here in red. Now, the frontal lobe controls executive function. In other words, voluntary movements, inhibitory control, attention and focus, problem resolution skills, social interaction, working memory, planning and organizing, reflection and prevision. So you can become more in control of your impulses, movements, you can focus more when your frontal lobe is more developed. And so language learning and use stimulates this part, and this makes bilingual people more competent in all of these executive functions of the brain. There is another important effect of bilingualism in the brain. This functional magnetic resonance image of a monolingual brain shows that both Broca and Wernicke's area are activated when a person is using the language. Now, if we look at the bilingual brain, we will see that even though the person is using just one language, both languages are being activated at the same time. So this means that even though I am speaking English right now, the zone of the brain where Spanish is stored is also being activated. So there are two competing pieces of information being activated at the same time. So contrary to what people usually think, that being bilingual is just like you turn on one language, you turn off the other, and so on. Actually, when we use one of the languages, the other one is active too. And therefore, the brain needs to organize this information and then change the priority to one language or the other. But both of them are active at the same time. And this has important implications for the functioning of the brain. Obvious consequence of this functioning of the brain that researchers have found is that bilinguals are better at identifying the two sides of an ambiguous or a reversible picture. So this means that us bilinguals can easily identify and see the same image from different perspectives. This is obviously because our brain is used to managing two different competing stimuli, and therefore we are more competent at this kind of task. The same happens with the Stroop effect. When confronted to the Stroop task, bilinguals are more effective at discriminating between two competing stimuli. So the name of the color does not correspond to the color itself, and bilingual people are better at distinguishing and being able to select the correct stimulus, ignoring the other one. And this is another important consequence then of this functioning of the brain, in which two competing languages are operating simultaneously in the brain. In conclusion then, learning and using two different languages or more can have a number of cognitive benefits. The first one is that bilingualism improves long-term memory and also semantic and episodic memories. We are better at remember concepts and events. And bilingualism also improves your working memory and your short-term memory, which allows you to manage like different kinds of information. Finally, the bilingual brain is better, if trained obviously, in problem resolution, mathematical problems. Some other important cognitive benefits include multicompetencies. So this means that a bilingual has a higher level of communicative competence than two monolinguals together. Now, what does that mean? This means that speaking two languages is not only being able to know and use each language independently, but that we can transfer some competencies from one language to the other. This is called skill transfer, and this also means that for bilinguals it's easier to learn additional languages. Something else that we can talk about is this ability to code switch, or using these translanguaging strategies. That means that we can use the knowledge of one language in order to find out information about another language, and then we can constantly be shifting from one language to the other in situations in which it is necessary and in which it is advantageous for us. And finally, we develop a higher level of metalinguistic competence. That means that because we're constantly comparing the languages, we are very aware of how words should be used, so this gives us higher precision in the use of words, and also we develop a higher competence at trying to find the meaning of words, and then developing an understanding of how languages operate, even though we are not aware of this. That's why metalinguistic competence is another very important benefit of bilingualism. Mental exercise provided by learning and using 2 or more languages has important benefits for your health as well. In other words, bilingualism can retard the mental decay that comes with old age. Using and learning 2 languages even after childhood can have this dynamic effect on the structure of the white matter of the brain that generates a protective effect of long term. This means that bilingualism can retard at least 3.9 years the onset of senile dementia, and for 2 years the onset of Alzheimer's disease. So by learning and using 2 or more languages, you're also protecting your health and guaranteeing that your brain is going to be active and healthy for a longer time. Another important effect of bilingualism is the development of intercultural competence. Now, this means that since the language is inextricably linked to culture, bilingual people have more than one cultural perspective of the world. And obviously, the fact that bilinguals are very interested in their own culture and the new cultures of the languages that they speak, they tend to develop a really high mediation and intercultural empathy that is way superior to the one of a monolingual person. We tend to accept more other ways of thinking, other ways of doing things, because we have learned by the use of 2 languages that not everything is the same. We become more flexible and we become more interculturally competent. And last but certainly not least, some researchers have found a link between bilingualism and happiness. It has been found that this flexibility, tolerance, and this openness to diversity that bilingual people have contribute to a large extent to the achievement of personal happiness. A bilingual person can also be happier, and obviously we are not forgetting that a bilingual person can read and watch movies in the original version, which is more enjoyable. A bilingual person will tend to travel more and make more friends of different countries, and sometimes even romance. So being bilingual is really a blessing. So the only thing left to say is, I'm bilingual. What's your superpower? So thanks a lot for your attention, and let's keep the conversation going via the different social media.